Hello, everybody. Welcome again to our expert talks with Asian experts. And today I have the pleasure to speak with Shaun Rein from China. Shaun is a very popular figure in the European, US-China business scenery. And we will gonna have a discussion today about US-Europe-China relationships on the brink of the inauguration of Donald Trump today. Shaun, very welcome to our discussion. And
Walker, thank you so much for having me today on the day that Trump becomes president for a second time. I think this is going to have major implications for European companies as they figure out how should they be dealing with China. So I think this is going to be a great conversation. So
that,
thank you for making time to invite me.
exactly, this is exactly our topic. And people who follow us, they know we are dealing with, let's say, Asian-European relationships for the last 25 years. A lot of cycles have happened, and at the moment, we'd like to understand where are we today in the economy, in the political cooperation between Europe and China. Shaun, maybe you'd like to start with giving a short intro. How do you see the China situation from the Chinese perspective? Are you in a competition? Are you in a cooperation, or are you in a partnership which has a little bit of clouds, I would like to say, where we have issues to deal with and nobody knows how to deal with them. So what's your take of the present situation from your Chinese perspective?
So that's a great question to start off, Walker. I think Chinese don't feel that they are in a competition or in a friendship with Europe and the United States wittingly. They feel that they've been forced into an adversarial relationship with both Europe and the United States, and they don't want it. So when you talk to leaders in Beijing, a lot of them, frankly, are perplexed about the level of anger, the level of vitriol coming from DC, and also coming from Ursula von der Leyen and Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany. I think at the end of the day, China's economy is weak right now. Very weak. You know, I've been in China for 28 years now, and this is probably the most challenging time facing the Chinese economy that I've seen in my almost 3 decades here.
Yeah.
So for the Chinese businessman, for the Chinese consumer, and for the Chinese government official, it's very clear that they want to have good relations with Europe. They want to be able to balance power away from the United States, sort of divide and conquer the Western European powers from the United States. And so they're in an adversarial relationship, but they don't want it. And I think that is a good opportunity for Germany and the next chancellor, for other European presidents like Macron to say, you know what, we need to have an independent foreign policy from the United States. We need to make sure that Europe doesn't become just a beautiful museum and not have real business. So I'm hopeful and I'm thankful that I think that Europe is going to pivot back to China and try to forge good relations. Because again, it's very clear on the Chinese side that they want good relations with Germany, and they're quite confused by the level of hatred, what they view as hatred coming from von der Leyen, coming from Baerbock.
But I'm also viewing that, and when I read the press and the media articles, I can share your sentiment. I'm asking myself the question, where is the cause for that, let's say, adversary issue, and why has it changed? Because if I look back, like, let's say, pre-COVID times, the German community, for example, they were basically dragged into China more and more and more. And if you didn't invest in China 10 years ago, you have been considered stupid or negligent or accused of negligence of the biggest potential market of the world. Today, we see a shift, China plus one strategy, things like that. What is is there a trigger, a cause which changed the tide into the direction you have described?
I think there are really two reasons. One is legitimate and one is illegitimate. So let me start with the illegitimate negative one. I think it comes from information warfare. I think the United States got worried about China's rise. You know, China started to compete with the United States on innovation and technology, and it was no longer just a cheap base for manufacturing T-shirts and shoes anymore. So when Trump came to power in 2016, he really targeted China in 2017 and launched an information warfare. Right now, Congress has passed a 1.6 billion US dollar bill to say bad things about China in the American and overseas press. I also, if you look at my own background, I was quoted weekly in Bloomberg for over 10 years. And then suddenly in 2017, I was never quoted by Bloomberg again, and I was never quoted by Wall Street Journal again. So I think there's an information warfare. And I think, unfortunately, the European nations have come under sway of American imperialism, which is why I said I think Europe needs to have an independent foreign policy, because it's a wonderful continent with wonderful countries, but it's being used, I think, and abused by the United States for America's own purposes in order to gain wealth. That's the illegitimate reason, which I hope we can sort of get away from as Trump starts to aim his rhetoric and attacks against Denmark, and inevitably will start to attack Europe, and Europe will need to bounce away from the United States. Yeah. But then second, I think there are more serious reasons. I think first off, German companies like a Porsche, a Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, they made huge profits in China. But in the last 5 or 6 years, those profits started to dwindle. Right. And the reality behind that is Chinese companies started to outcompete Western European nations companies. When you look in the auto sector, BYD or NIO, but especially BYD, honestly was a shoddy crap company. They made terrible cars 5-10 years ago. But during the COVID period, when European auto companies, their senior executives weren't able to come into China, many of their executives at a Volkswagen were trying to get out because of the difficulties of just everyday living in China. That's when BYD suddenly went from a crap car company to a car company that makes unbelievably cars at every different price point. So they're competing against Stellantis, they're competing against Volkswagen at the low end, they're competing at the mid end against BMW and Mercedes, but then they just launched, a 200,000 US dollar car that competes with Porsche at the high end. So I think what European nations are starting to say is China's not so lucrative anymore. We're starting to drop our sales and our profits maybe 10, 20%. We're starting to be outcompeted. How is this possible? And they're starting to get scared, so they're turning towards protectionism. So I think it's natural that European nations are fearful of a hollowing out of the industrial base in Europe, like what happened in the United States, because the US was able to make a pivot towards services and innovation. Will Europe be able to do that? I'm not sure. And that's why you're seeing that very ugly protectionism wield its head in Europe when it comes towards adding tariffs on Chinese NEVs, which the CEO of Mercedes today said, I don't want these tariffs. We need to have competition. But it's the national security guys, it's the bigots, it's the warmongers in Europe who have power right now. And I think that they're fearful of Europe losing money and its way of life. That is a more legitimate concern, but I don't like how they're attacking China. They should look for common ground areas to cooperate, because again, I think China wants to invest in Europe. I think China wants to have good relations with Europe, but it's very hard when you have Ursula von der Leyen, when you have the Prime Minister of Denmark, when you have all of these various people blaming China for, say, the war in Ukraine, and saying that China's an enemy. I just did a CNBC interview recently, and the person speaking in front of me was a member of parliament from Finland. And she said, China is aiding and supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, and they should be condemned. Now, I have no proof of this, but if they are doing it, they should be condemned. But again, they don't have any proof. So at the end of the day, I'm hopeful that Europe and China can get back on the right track, especially Germany. I think Germany is the country that China cares most about and is most willing to try to forge deals to continue to have good partnerships.
Yeah, I agree to most of what you have said. And I feel also sometimes when we look at the problems the German economy and the German companies have, China is made a little bit of a scapegoat, a cheap excuse why things are not happening. We are saying China is competing with low cost and cheap stuff, and they are subsidizing everything. They have been stealing technology in the past, and now they are getting the fruits of all that. what do you say, or what is the counter argument when you say, for example, the success of the Chinese EV vehicle companies is basically or mainly due to heavy subsidies by the Chinese government in bringing up these companies to the level where they are now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the IP stealing, that was an issue 20 years ago. And that would be more on, say, the combustible engine. We need to look at what's been happening in China in the last 5, 10 years. And I don't see IP infringement or IP theft being as big of an issue. I mean, if you look at it, the Chinese NEVs are better than the European NEVs. So it's not like they're stealing technology that didn't exist in Europe. So that is a easy criticism that people who want to denigrate China can say. Now, when it comes to subsidies, you have to remember that China was giving subsidies not just to not just to Chinese auto manufacturers, but foreign auto manufacturers too. I mean, when you look at Tesla, almost their entire new factory or large portions of their factory in Shanghai was actually subsidized by the Shanghainese government. So European companies have also benefited from this. So these are just easy sound bites that, if you dig down a little bit deeper, they don't make a lot of sense when you really get into the weeds and really see what's happening. What I would love to see happen is more reciprocity. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, for decades, European companies made billions and billions of profit in China. I know because I helped a lot of these companies profit here. They're now starting to get hit hard. But when they came into China, they had to do joint ventures with Chinese companies. They had to move some of their intellectual property legally into China. I think it would be fair if there's reciprocity in Europe. So what I mean by that is, I think it's fair that they say to Chinese companies, if you're going to invest in a factory or establish your operations in Europe, you need to do it with a European joint venture partner. I think that's a very fair thing to say. I don't like these tariffs. That just gets a lot of anger in the Chinese business community that the Europe is being hypocritical. They've been speaking about free trade for decades, but as long as now they start to be outcompeted, they now go protectionist. I would like to see the word move from decoupling and de-risking and move away from IP protection towards reciprocity. And I think that would be fair. And I think most Chinese would be accepting of that. They just want to find a way that they can invest in France or invest in Denmark and not be called a national security threat. I think the fear mongering and hysteria over Chinese rise has come out too high, but there are legitimate concerns. Let's go into joint ventures or partnerships and alleviate some of those economic concerns.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And if I look into, let's say, a little bit the historical perspective, I had a discussion with a Chinese business lady at that point, and she said also, why are you complaining about China competition? It's a natural development, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the early 2000s. Like you said, we were making tons of money by selling our machines and engineering products and cars. And now we have grown up from a little baby to a toddler, and now we are a juvenile. We are ready to compete with you. And it's a little bit like in the sports, in the Olympics. Suddenly you have a new competitor and you have to deal with it, and you have to get your act together. You have to redesign your training methods. You have to out-compete again on fair level playing ground, like you say. And that is something.
Exactly. And a large part of the problem, Walker, is the European governments. Let's look at the auto sector, right? They're forcing the European auto manufacturers to become NEV makers. But the problem is that is in many ways, it's a similar business to the internal combustion engine, but in many ways, it's a completely different sector. So when you look at a company like Porsche, they've had to adopt, electric and become electric vehicles, but they don't have the inside know-how. And so they're getting screwed by the new regulation. And you look at it, their new Taycan electric vehicles sales dropped 49% last year. Their overall sales in China dropped about 28%, and nobody wants to buy the electric Macan. People would buy a Porsche because it had the best engineering in the world. The best engineering when it comes to driver handling and when it comes to the ICE engines. But when it comes to new energy vehicles, what do they know? Are their cars better than what the Chinese have? And so if I was a European automaker, I would actually be more angry at Europe for forcing them and destroying their business in ice overnight, essentially, rather than letting the regular competition take place, like what's happening in China. That was a self-inflicted wound by the Europeans.
Yeah, very true. And I'd like to come back to one or two of the buzzwords you have mentioned, especially which came from the German and the European governments, saying China plus one strategy, decoupling, de-risking. And what I observe in the business community is that even though we see these, let's say, these political headlines or paradigms changing, if you talk to the individual companies, to the individual CEOs, I would say in general, they don't give much attention to that. They continue to invest. If we look at the investment numbers in China, take BASF, for example, even the car makers, they are still investing quite heavily. And they still believe it's still one of the largest, most attractive, fastest growing markets in the world. And if we give up on that, we are not a global player anymore. So how do you see the, let's say,
I think
between the political,
China is going through a rough time economically, but China should be the major growth driver for German and European companies. You have a middle class that's swelling from 400 million to 800 million over the next decade. You have a GDP growth of 5% around there. That's like adding an entire Vietnam and Thai economy. So when it looks at scale, the businessmen who are close to the ground understand China's the next China, which is why they're investing billions, exactly like you said. That's why I'm very critical of Ursula von der Leyen, probably even more critical of Sergej Wuttke, who was the head of the European Chamber of Commerce in China, because he was really pushing de-risking. It was almost like he wanted to become a diplomat or wanted to become a foreign policymaker for Europe. And he wasn't listening to what German companies really wanted. And so here's the problem. When you have Sergej and you have von der Leyen saying de-risk, 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 what do you think the Chinese government and the Chinese companies are going to do? They're going to stop buying European products. They're going to stop buying European services because they're worried that if they were to put an order in for a German company, that at some point the German government would say, nope, we're going to ban sales of this German component to China. And so naturally, the Chinese got worried about regulation, so they started shifting their supply chain procurement to Chinese brands, to brands that they could trust over the supply chain. It's like nobody in China wanted to buy Chinese semiconductors, but because ASML gave into the Biden regime's demands not to ship their highest end technology to China, now Chinese companies don't want to buy ASML. They want to trust and buy a trusted supply chain. And so I think Sergej Wuttke and Ursula von der Leyen should be shamed and criticized by the German business community for really shooting Germans in the foot, because Chinese companies, they hear the German industry wanting to invest on the one hand, but then they hear the government side saying don't invest on the other hand. They're going to trust the politicians. They're not going to trust the German companies.
Well, maybe you consider investing in Vietnam or in Malaysia or Indonesia as a counterbalance. And of course,
exactly,
not helping China too much, And but let's look into the future a little bit, Shaun, and let's look into the glass bowl. Today we see Trump coming in with his second term. What is your prediction in the short term, the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months? We have heard and read that Trump has already had a good conversation on the phone with President Xi. It was all like smooth and friendship discussion. What is your assessment? Are we going to continue along the path we are sailing at the moment, or will there be a change of tide towards one or the other more harsh direction?
So Trump is a master negotiator, or at least he thinks of himself as a master negotiator. And so he's going to do shock and awe to try to pressure other countries, whether it be Greenland and Denmark, the Panama Canal in Panama, threatening 60% tariffs on China. But he's going to try to keep Xi Jinping and the CPC unbalanced. On the one hand, he's going to be friendly and give olive branches, saying, come to the inauguration for Vice President Han Zheng. If Xi Jinping can't come, let's save TikTok. But I think, in a week or two, he could slam China. He never wants to be viewed as stable. He's more about extracting as much as he can, extracting from allies like Canada, extracting from adversaries like China. So I don't think there's going to be smooth sailing anytime soon. This is all part of a dance. It's all part of the way Trump negotiates, because at the end of the day, he wants to extract as much as he can from China. On the good side, though, I think by saying he had a good call with Xi, by not calling him a thug like Biden did, by saying essentially he doesn't really care about Taiwan that much, I think we're going to see an increase in rhetoric and tension when it comes to trade, but a decrease in rhetoric and tension when it comes to the military. And I think that's really important. The Chinese government is willing to play hardball with the United States and Trump and try to forge a good economic cooperation. They understand that. What they get really angry about is red lines over Taiwan, red lines over Xinjiang, red lines over Hong Kong. So I'm hopeful that Trump is going to lower some of the military-like tension, which I think would actually cause Chinese businesses and Chinese consumers to go out and spend more. There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines. There's almost 20 trillion US dollars of money from Chinese consumers in the bank. They're not spending it right now because they're worried about the future. They're worried about war. They're worried about geopolitical tension. If Trump and Xi can come to sort of, we'll fight an economic war, but we're not going to fight an actual war. That's going to get the Chinese business community and the Chinese consumer to go out and spend more. So I think Trump is going to be better for China than Biden was. Absolutely. And it might surprise people, but most Chinese prefer Trump. Second, and final, I'll keep it brief, is I think Trump is going to be very negative for Europe. He's not going to be supportive of Europe from a military standpoint in NATO. He's going to try to extract as much as he can from Germany and France, the way he's doing with Denmark over Greenland, because he wants the rare earth that's in Denmark. I think Europe has a wonderful opportunity, but they have a very short window to say to China, we want to forge good relations. We want to get back on track to the way it was in 2010. We want to get back to the Angela Merkel era and forget Scholz and really forget Baerbock. I mean, forget Ursula von der Leyen, because they're truly terrible toward being diplomats.
Yeah. What I can add to your thoughts is my experience is really when you talk about, let's say, the broad global economic and political issues, it's, as you say, there's a big hoo-ha, nobody knows what's happening. But when I meet and talk to, let's say, our business friends and partner on a one-to-one business level, they are all very much the same. Everybody is down to earth. They want to remove the hurdles for business. They want to do better and more business. And that is what keeps me going. That's what keeps me motivated, because at the end of the day, we are all human beings. I'd like to ask about how's your family growing, how are your kids doing at school or university. So at the end of the day, it's about mutual cooperation, about partnership, about helping each other. And this is also our philosophy in our business projects, that we are not here to solve, let's say, global political problems, which we are keenly observing and discussing, but let's do what we can do on our, let's say, project level in the daily business. Maybe a last word, Shaun, you have...
Well said. I mean, people are people. It's governments that seem to screw everything up, and selfish politicians.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Shaun, we are coming to the end of our discussion. I think we could have going on for another 1 or 2 hours easily. I'd like to make a short mention of your latest book. You have it in the backdrop, The Split. Highly recommended reading. And
it just came out in Germany in December.
Very well, yeah. And I have seen the English version already. A very good read. Highly recommended. And it's great to speak to you, Shaun. Let's keep in touch, and we will watch closely what is going to happen. And thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Volker, for having me. And I hope all of your listeners and clients really understand China's economy is weak, but it's not that weak. China remains the next China for most German and many European companies. Absolutely.
Whether it's 5%,
thank you so much.
Yes, we are all jealous of these growth rates, especially in Germany these days. We are looking forward to an exciting new year. And Gongxi Fa Chai, Chinese New Year is coming up. Have a good
Thank
time.
you very much.
Speak to you soon, Shaun. Bye-bye.
Perfect.